Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And now the host that's allowed to use the copier, but only with supervision.
Oh, don't you know, it's the Bill Arnold Show. It's Bill.
And a warm welcome to the Bill Arnold Show. I'm so glad we're going to spend some time together today. I've got J. Warner Wallace as my guest. I'm going to bring him on in just a minute. You can learn more about him at coldcasechristianity.com. An amazing speaker, presenter, professor, author. He does it all and does it all very well. I've got all of his books in my library. I can tell you where they are on my bookshelf. So that means I go there and visit them often because they're that good. Jim, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate you so much, as you know.
Yeah, I appreciate you very much. You know, it's not often I have a former cold case homicide detective as my guest on a day like this because of all that's going on in the world.
That's true. It's always hard to comment on some of these cases because you're like everybody else. We're watching them unwrap right before our eyes, and I just know the nature of working these kinds of cases. We are highly protective of information, and sometimes that being protective of information just makes it people are more and more curious then, and they assume the worst. And there's a conspiracy, or what are they hiding from us? And often it's just the nature of working these kinds of cases. Nothing good comes out of releasing information prior to trial. It just doesn't really unless of course, and you kind of see this sometimes with cases in the last year where we're at a standstill from an investigative perspective, and then we will release information to the public, hoping to get a tip, hoping to get a clue. That often happens when you have video, something where you think, maybe somebody will recognize this guy. Okay, great. And you've probably dried up every other investigative avenue before you do that, right? Because you're really just trying to protect the integrity of the criminal trial when it goes to trial. And it's always better not to have information out there that people can then run with, start to contact your witnesses, start to try to get ahead of you in the investigation. We have a podcast landscape right now where people are actually investigating cases as if they are detectives, and it often just makes a mess of things. So We're always trying to hide information, protect the information, and assemble the case. And that often feels to the public like you're hiding something from them. No, we're just trying to make sure that the case doesn't get corrupted by somebody else putting their hands on it.
Well, yeah, because people are following it a lot. We're talking about, of course, the Nancy Guthrie case. And Jim, how would you describe what happened? Would you call it a disappearance, an abduction? How would you describe it?
Well, again, so much of this, and I've been watching, I'm thinking, okay, so if I was the guy working this case, I'll just give you some broad principles that I would probably employ. First of all, everything's on the table when you first start. Everything from the most extreme version of what this could have happened to the most benign version. Everything from she's been abducted by complete strangers who have some motive to exploit the family in some way, either whatever it may be, like you would have in a typical kind of Lindbergh kidnapping where you're making demands, or whatever it may be, where you're making demands for money, whatever it might be, all the way to she disappeared because she got lost or had an accident, so the most benign to the most vile. You're considering everything. Also, you're considering everyone is a suspect. When you first start, everyone's a suspect because you want to make sure you don't leave a stone unturned.
Right.
And that means the people who are reporting it, everyone who you might think, you're being very, very judicious about treating victims like victims. At the same time, you're leaving the door open that anyone could be involved in this. And so when you start that way with this huge spectrum of causes, you have, look, that's the kind of personality that does a good job working in investigations because it's considering all the options. And then just starting to narrow down the options as you exclude certain people from the case or certain causes from the case. But of course, that attitude just doesn't work well in your personal life, right? Or doesn't work well in your marriage, or work well when you're investigating your kids when they get home late from from an event. Those are the
Yeah.
kinds of things that make you a pretty decent investigator, but hard to live with.
So one of the things that I have found interesting is some of the commentators have said, well, this guy clearly is an amateur. And I'm thinking, oh, he's an amateur, yet she's been missing for 11 days and there's no clue as to where she is and there's no leads as to who he might be.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, at this point, and I've resisted requests to speak about this because I think I'm still at the point where everything's on the table.
I agree.
I mean, everything's on the table. I'm not leaning in one really direction or another. I mean, I don't know enough about Nancy Guthrie to know what it is she might provide, and what are you after here? What are you trying to get here? Is it a certain amount of money? Why would you think that this is the person who's going to, of all the targets you could possibly hit, why this one? So there's still so much that has to be revealed, and I think and we're all scratching our heads like, wow, there's some weird. Well, why are we scratching our heads? Because there's an entire body of information that is right now known to the investigators, and they have been very careful about releasing it judiciously.
Mm-hmm.
So while we are scratching our heads and going, I'm not sure that this doesn't make any sense, they've already got much. They're ahead of us by several steps, as they should be, without telling us so much that we can then make a mess of it. Because 30 years ago, if you had a case like this, you could release information in bits and pieces. How's it going to get out? It's going to get out through what? Print media? The local newspaper?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if a regional, something like this, of course, national news picks it up. But there wasn't social media where you got thousands of voices that can spin in one direction or the other. And an environment really where an assumption about the case gets feet. And then everyone believes it before. This is really an environment where you need to be even more protective of information early in an investigation. I would only be releasing things to the public if I got to a place where there's no other way to go forward unless I release this, for example, this ring video or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to be at the end of my investigative leads before I start releasing information. Because then what happens, of course, is people say, well, look how amateur this, like all these conversations are only occurring because we've released little bits of information. If you didn't release any of that, there'd be no conversation about it at all. We would be asking, bigger, and you see this with the Charlie Kirk murder also, where it's like, well, if they're protecting information, is there a conspiracy involved in this? I mean, all these, and there's an entire cottage industry of people broadcasting on on guesswork. And that's something that we have to kind of protect ourselves from, because if nothing else, do you want your witnesses, the potential witnesses who get identified because you've released too much information, to be constantly harangued by people who think they're going to, break something on the internet and increase their platform? So I think we really have to be patient here, is I guess what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And I don't assume incompetence, because the lack of information we're getting does not mean they're not moving on something every single day and making really good progress on this case. And in the end, I'm looking forward, like everybody else, to see like which version of crime this ends up being. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's nothing right now that would surprise me in terms of how it turns out.
Mm-hmm. Jim, let's go to your home church in your garage, and let's just say there's 80 people there, and you're at the front. And the question is, how should we be thinking about a story like this, which is absolutely consuming the news cycle? What should we be thinking?
Well, I think what's great about this story, in a good sense, is that we are appropriately concerned for the life of this woman.
Yes, we are.
And we have an appropriate concern for human life, human dignity, all those things. Of course we should be concerned. Of course we should be concerned. I think that what we don't want to do is, and this is how I feel as somebody who's maybe in the public sphere a little bit, and I'm not that how well known am I? Not that well. But the point is, I'm out there enough that I want to make sure that when I am talking about this case, I'm not talking about it for the reason. Look, I don't do a podcast where I just take whatever's in the news headlines and try to leverage it to get an audience. But you see, there's a lot of that going on in influencers. I love talking about the things that are evergreen,
I do
that are
too.
true today
I do too.
and are true, 100 years from now or true 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Those are typically big philosophical ideas about how we live as humans, theological ideas about what is true about God, what's true about us. Those things don't change, and they're not dependent on the news. And so I'm always trying to stay in those evergreen areas
Me too.
rather than now what that means is if you're doing that, be prepared that you will not grow as fast as your friend who lights on every single piece of news media
Hmm.
because that's what draws audiences is
I
like
agree.
what's the latest about Nancy Guthrie. I totally get it.
Yeah.
I want to be open-handed about it. Am I convinced that she's I have, so I just don't know enough yet to even speculate whether she's alive or dead or any of that. But, of course, my hopes are like everybody else, that in the end, this is going to be something outrageous that is going to bring her back alive.
Well, I apologize if I brought this subject up without talking to you about it in advance, because I didn't really want to take you there for very long. I wanted to just get it started. And then I want to say, what would life be like if we obeyed the ninth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor? There seems to be
Well, that's
a
so funny.
world full of
It's so
lies.
funny that it's so funny that you say that because you and I, our policy basically is, I'll connect with you 5 seconds before the show starts, but having no idea what it is we're talking about, and
Right,
I'll just let you take it, and
right.
we'll just go from there. And I think that's great. It's awesome. Yeah, you're right. We didn't talk about this in advance. So for me, this is one of those cases especially, but there's so many different directions. There's some things I'm thinking in my head that I know if I say will just start a
Yeah,
firestorm.
no, I don't want
So
that.
there's no point in even going there. I just think I have to have enough respect for the investigators who are involved in the case. Now, I will say this, in general principles about this kind of case, and that's typically where I try to stay, right? Like, what's the evergreen reality
Yes.
about this a specific case? Well, number one, they are very rare. These kinds of cases are very rare, and you will work as a detective in a local police department. And remember, detectives and local police departments are local police officers who have worked through that process, and 10 years into their career, they're assigned to detectives. It's not like we have no, are we trained along the way? Yes. Do we attend schools and classes? Yes. Do we do a ton of cases and get experience? Yes. But we're just like everybody else, and we are working these cases, and you might work in an agency like this your entire career, my dad's entire career, my son's entire career. We have none of us in 65 years of working with the same name at the same agency has ever dealt with a kidnapping case.
Wow.
Not like this, where we're kidnapping for ransom. But
Yeah.
if I worked kidnap, yes, but they're different kinds of cases than this. This kidnap for ransom is a very, very rare anomaly in crime in America to begin with. So whoever gets this case is like, oh, geez, they're working a case that unlike anything they've ever seen or will ever see again. How much expertise do you? This is why federal agents have a far better chance of having experience in this because they get to oversee what's happening in all 50 states and every of all the thousands of municipal agencies that they are always brought in. So you've got people there who probably have some better idea of what to do in the next step of this than the local police officer who's now working as a. So this case has been assigned to a local police department who are working in conjunction with the FBI. Why? Well, because this kind of case you're likely to have no expertise in. And so you want some help. You want somebody who's been there, done that before, or at least is in an agency. Look, there's some agencies in California, in the United States, and in California, my state, in which the agency has never had to investigate a case like this. Forget about a single detective. In the history of the agency, there's never been anything like this. So that's why you want to bring in people who maybe at least have a touch, have some sense of what they're doing.
Well, that's a very evergreen comment. So thank you for that. And I hope you're not mad at me. Are you mad at me?
No, don't be silly.
Okay,
No,
good.
but I think you're right. There are, like you said, there are some things that I think about as somebody who speaks publicly about these kinds of cases.
Yes.
That I just know they're evergreen, right? And part of it is what we are so. This is true for every aspect of media. We love gossip, which is probably why there are so many admonitions against gossip, not just in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well, and that gossipers are thought of in a certain way. And if you think about it, it's not just this news, it's like murder cases. I'm obsessed with NFL football when the season's on, right? And so then we see all the games over the weekend, and then there's like 2 or 3 days, and Monday and Tuesday, where you've got sportscasters who have talk shows talking about football after the fact. And if you look at what the topics are they're talking about, they're just speculating. It's gossip. It's basically like it's like sports gossip makes up the entire sports talk show industry. So we love gossip. We love to speculate. So and so said this. Did you hear why so and so has been hired by that team? It's all, in a sense, the same thing. That we feed it. We don't resist it. We don't see it as something we ought to control so we can improve our character. Instead, we just indulge it all the time on all these different shows. We constantly do it. So that's why it's nice once in a while to step back and say, okay, let's just talk about something that's not rooted in the gossip of the day.
Oh, well said, Jim. Thank you. We're going to take a little break and come right back with J. Warner Wallace. You can learn more about him at coldcasechristianity.com. We'll be right back. You might be the kind of person that goes to Paris and still listens to Faith Radio on the app. And I'm thinking of a particular couple from northern Minnesota. Or you might be more like the person that just goes into the next room in your apartment and listens. Well, the good news is using the app is just as easy in both places. Downloading the free app is crazy easy. Just text the word app to 877-933-2484 and then click the link. And if you happen to be in Paris, there is a coffee shop, but you should see the prices of biscotti. They have gone through the roof. I recommend avoiding it. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. Learn more about him at coldcasechristianity.com. Let me get back to the question I had about the ninth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. What would this world be like, Jim, if there was people that just told the truth?
Well, I mean, look, all of us struggle with telling the truth. I mean, even in terms of just small inconvenient or convenient lies that help us to kind of navigate our relationships. You know, like when I asked my wife, "Am I losing my hair?" I mean, is she being totally honest with me in her response? You know, probably not. And she's just trying to save my feelings, right? So I mean, we all have a trouble with this. There are some. We used to use this tank principle when I was a youth pastor, right? We would say, if you're going to say something to somebody, make sure it follows the tank principle, TANK. First of all, is it true? We don't want to say things that aren't true. But the second two, A and the N, is it absolutely necessary? Because there are lots of things that are true that aren't necessary to say because they would either make things more difficult or be hurtful. And then finally, the K is for kind. So is it true, absolutely necessary, and kind? So that simple principle, right, is the principle we used to teach our kids all the time in youth group. And I think that is a character issue, right? Like, because I think it's really easy to get legalistic and say, okay, here's my rule. I'm going to say whatever's true. Okay, remember that movie, was it Liar Liar? The movie that was, what a great movie, right? Because there are lots of things that are not necessary to say. And so you have to, that's where discretion comes in. Of course, you could argue, well, whether I did this crime or not, it's not necessary that I say that, right? So you could hold back a truth by using that same principle. That's really, in the end, you're never going to get a hard set of rules that allows you, because that kind of legalistic view of how you speak truth, you end up like the guy on Liar Liar, where you're just like a club. You're running around using the truth like a club. So I think it's important for us. That's why we're always going to have to. And isn't that what life is? Isn't that the sanctification we talk about? We talk about that long process of just trying to figure out what is the right way to respond in this situation, given what I know. And it's not as though once you have the rule, quote unquote, in place, you can just act without thinking. Every one of these requires you to use some discernment. And it's that process of using discernment that makes you good at discerning. Like, we give you this tool, but unless you're willing to use the tool, you never get good with it. And so you have this tool called discernment, and you have to use it all the time. So God puts us in a place where it's not as easy as you might think. I've got the rule in place, but I still have to learn how to use it.
Yeah, I hear people say, I need just to be brutally honest. And I think oftentimes they're more brutal than they are honest. They show up with,
and I can tell you, go ahead.
No, they just show up being more brutal than anything.
Yeah, it is a trick, right? So
Yeah.
I think I told you this story a long time ago when I was in Houston at a Christian school talking to teachers and really talking about the nature of what is God by his very nature? How could we describe him, and how the Old Testament describes him as the fullness of truth and grace, or the fullness of justice and mercy, and even in the New Testament, Jesus as is described this way. These because no human has these two things in fullness. Either we're brutally truthful, like you're saying, and we have no grace at all, or we
Right.
don't even want to speak the truth because we're all about loving everybody and never want to call anybody out. So to hold both of these in their fullness is only one being on in the universe does this. This is God. Everyone else is fallen in one direction or the other. So when Jesus is said to come in the fullness of truth and grace in a chapter in the Gospel of John that is all about the deity of Christ, John chapter 1, well, that really does tell us something that, yeah, we have to be able to be more godly is to speak the truth in a loving way and to love people enough to speak the truth. Both of these things have to be held. And I can tell you, most people, if you ask them to give you a list of synonyms, that's like I did in that school in Houston, give me a list of synonyms for love. You'll see all kinds of things that are about compassion and grace and tolerance and understanding and forgiveness. You will not find them use one synonym that has anything to do with truth. But you know that if you're going to love like God loves, you have to love with those two things at their fullest. You cannot just do one without the other. And that's where I think is the biggest challenge for us is, there's a truth about even these cases we're talking about. And the question is, how do I, this is what's hard about being an investigator, because what we have to do is assume the very worst in even the outwardly most kind person we see in the work of this case. We're going to meet a lot of people in this case, all kinds of people who are going to be witnesses and family members and potential victims, all that stuff. And a lot of them are going to seem to us to be the sweetest people we've ever met. But if you're going to work the case properly, you're going to have to assume the worst in everyone, and then at some point chase that truth claim in your head, test it anyway by chasing it, and then see if it works out. And that's why often you'll see that if cops aren't good at being able to express truth and mercy at the same time, their investigative pathways will alienate a bunch of witnesses, alienate a bunch of family members that won't like that guy because he's not balancing those two. He's just going after everybody.
Whoa.
But that's how you're going to get to the truth. But so that's why I say, even as a cop, we have to learn how to balance those two things. You and I were talking about this before, that sometimes like emergency medical services or fire are better at the grace and mercy side of rescuing people, but they won't go in the building until it's cleared by us. But the cop is willing to go in the building and clear it, but he's
Hmm.
not always good at the grace and mercy side. So
Hmm.
so trying to find that balance is an important part of doing this job.
Yeah. Jim, I'd like to talk a little bit more about discernment. And I think I started because I want to grow in discernment. I want to become more wise. I remember years ago, I thought whenever I write an email, I want to make sure I read the email and maybe take out the last sentence.
Yeah.
And that might make the email kinder, more gentle, and better received.
Yeah, boy, this is I think we're living in a world too, and I was been thinking a lot about this lately about the impact that AI is going to have. Because how many times do you say, well, I just want to write an email. I'd like to review it. And well, how many people do you know now who are using AI to do that? They are basically writing their emails. I know people who are using it to write text messages.
Wow.
Like they're saying, okay, so I want to say this. And I know a young man who wants to be very cordial with a young lady that he's interested in. But before he sends her a text messages, he worries that he's not being, sweet enough or whatever it may be. And he's been running him through AI to make sure that it sounds better. And I thought, wow, if we do this a lot, we're going
Yeah.
to lose the capacity to discern innately on our own because we've assigned that kind of thing to a tool. And so if you're writing, and I see this a lot though, people will write an email and then they'll run it through AI and say, make it more professional, make it more whatever, make it
Wow.
more loving, make it more whatever it is, right? And then they'll hit that thing out. And I thought, well, okay, now we're losing that tool. We're losing the ability to edit for ourselves, to think for ourselves.
Hmm.
And I wonder if we're heading into a world now where we're gonna feel like I don't need to master that because I can run that through AI first.
Yeah, Jim, we're from the generation that in ninth grade we would send a girl a note. If you like me, check this box.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a generation before that, you just punch her in the arm and see how she responded. So I mean, this is kind of how we're going, right? We're heading in this direction. So I do think discernment is going to be almost in some ways, and also I think when we're in a polarized environment like we are right now, because discernment often means trying to find, having some empathy, trying to see in the other something with which you can connect, and that will bring you to a middle ground. And so discernment often is about trying to find that negotiable middle ground with people, and also trying to figure out like who's discerning, who's is even worth doing that with, or who isn't. So I do kind of wonder if as we, decide, and also, are we going to start using, is AI going to affect our ability to distinguish truth from a lie, or cloud it? Because isn't discernment really mostly this capacity to distinguish true things from false things?
Yeah, right and wrong,
Good
wise and
good things
unwise.
from evil things,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Wise things from unwise things.
yeah.
And I wonder if number one, we'll just assign that to AI, and if number two, we will always be fooled by something that's not even true because AI does such a good job of presenting it to us.
Mm-hmm. Jim, is common sense mostly dead?
Yeah, I love that expression. Like, what is common sense?
I don't know. I think we need to revisit that because I grew up and I was taught common sense, and I try to apply it in my life today, and it just runs into a brick wall.
Well, and this is the one thing we'll say all the time with jurors, that we don't put experts on jury panels. We just don't do that. We might call an expert in to talk about DNA, to talk about ballistics, to talk about something, psychology, whatever it may be. We might call in an expert, but we tell the jurors that they are not obligated to trust that expert. They can evaluate that aspect that expert. In the end, we tell them that we want them to use their common sense. That's enough. Your common sense is sense enough. But what do we mean by, like, you almost need to define I think what we really think it is that like it's this basic ability we all should have to be able to make judgments, to be able to make draw practical conclusions or inferences just about the stuff that we deal with every day. The stuff that is, but that assumes though that we all now have this same kind of reasonableness. And I wonder, is there, in a world in which we are so polarized, how much do we really hold in common anymore?
Yeah, good point. I think it was Nietzsche that said, "I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset that from now on I can't believe you."
Yeah, what a shame well, and this is something we talk about. That's a jury instruction. If you catch someone lying about something, that is fair. It's fair game. Now you can say that person is a liar. Now we would say, well, look, if you caught him lying about something because he was embarrassed, he might still be telling you the truth about something else. You have to assess why it is he might have lied about this other thing. He might have lied about this because he's so embarrassed of his own behavior, but he can still describe the color of the car. You don't need to disregard his description of the color just because he didn't want to say that I was in it. So I think in the end, we have to kind of ask the question, why does somebody fail to speak the truth, if we're not going to call it a lie? But why would somebody do that? And often some of the reasons why people would move to lie are the kinds of things that we could, again, use your common sense. We could say, yeah, if that was me, I might do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Is common sense biblical?
Oh man, you got some good questions today.
Well, I'm all loaded
I
up
do
for
think. Well, I think, okay, well, look, so if we're saying is common sense biblical, well, what do we mean is does the Bible ever acknowledge the existence of common sense? Sure. But if you're saying is common sense the kind of thing we ought to rely on, does the Bible argue that we ought to rely on common sense? Well, I think we would say that where we are right now between the two gardens, in the messy middle
Right.
of the fallen world in which we live, that humans cannot, whatever we hold in common, it's a fallen. We don't have the ability to assess um, um, assess evidence in front of us, assess the world around us without this fallen inclination we have. But you'll see in like Proverbs, for example, you'll see all the time that common sense is referred to as a positive. It's usually called something like, I don't know, like prudence, or this idea of having this common sense. But we have to also recognize, though, that we can't trust our first inclination about things. That we have to think through things rather than this difference between, we talked about, I think once before, about the difference between reacting and responding. That time, that the only difference between reacting and responding is a period of time in which you stop and contemplate what it is you're about to do. Well, I think part of what we don't do is we act so quickly that we don't even tap into what it might be common sense. Instead, we're always reacting emotionally to what's happening around us.
J. Warner Wallace is my guest. Please go to coldcasechristianity.com. Check out everything at his website. Buy one of his books. You won't regret it. And we will be back in a couple of minutes. I'm with J. Warner Wallace today. So glad that he has made time once again in his busy schedule. Jim, you're just one of my go-to guys. I always wonder what Jim would think when it comes to certain topics. And every time I go to coldcasechristianity.com, I always feel a little encouraged, and I feel like, oh, I love the way Jim thinks on this. And recently you talked about believers that can serve without needing applause or even income, and how their daily acts, just loving church, loving people, discipling people, is really going to have a big eternal impact, bigger than anything.
Well, and it's kind of what we just were talking about, right? You and I were talking about how are we lighting on every single, like, why are we picking up these topics to talk about anyway? And I guess what I saw in the last, really since Charlie Kirk was assassinated, was an entire, and it still continues, this cottage industry that keeps on either focusing on his organization or focusing on him, focusing on what, and it really, I wonder, is this interesting to the person who's constantly returning to it, or is this just they realize that if all, and I suppose if I was to go back and all the articles and podcasts and videos that we create, like I don't go back and check and say, well, which ones are going viral? I probably should, but to me, I'm already interested in something else. So I'm already I don't want to go back and talk about the things I've already talked about. I've already talked about them. So let's find what's the next interesting thing. And so I recently we just it was today, Wednesday, so we released it today. My just kind of thinking, and I do podcasts every week about, okay, so what's the point of all this? Is the point of all this? We always talk about, why does anyone do anything they shouldn't do? Well, they do it for sex, money, or power. That's it. Those are the things that drive us toward misbehavior. And this is true even for those of us who are in the public realm, who are either podcasting. And by the way, that's a lot of people now. I mean, I say this is not like inside the Beltway kind of conversation, because so many people have got a podcast now. So the question becomes, like, what are you talking about? I've been really fortunate, and I did it because I remember when I first got ready to retire, I had a very good friend who runs a very large apologetics ministry in America, who wanted me to come out a couple of years early to join his organization. And I said, no, I can't. And well, why not? Well, because it's like a 6% difference in my retirement, if I stay or if I go. And he says, so you will not serve God in this capacity for 6%. I said, wow. I said, yeah, I won't. I said, no, I'm going to wait. And here's why. Because when I join you, I will be able to join you as a volunteer. It'll cost you nothing, because I won't need a salary.
Right.
Because I will have a pension that will take care of my life, in terms of our modest. And of course, a lot of that, like we've always talked about, is, financial independence is not the ability to buy anything. It's the ability to buy anything you want. And if you don't want anything, you're pretty much financially independent really quick. And that was really where I was. So it took the idea off the table. Like, do I need to do this topic because no one's paying attention to the podcast, or there's not enough listeners to the podcast, or I can't get advertising revenue because advertisers don't see a high enough number of listenership? Well, no, and now I can take the money out. So now it's about, what do I want to talk about this week? Like, what's on your mind? And that's just much more fun for me. And it allows me to chase different things. And so then, of course, part of the thing, we talk about money, sex, and power. Power is another part of this, because the subsets of power are celebrity, that's a power issue.
Mm-hmm.
Influence, that's a power issue. Perceived authority, that's a power issue. So a lot of us are we doing this topic because we want one of those three things? That's no better than doing it for money. So the reality, how do you take those things out? And this is why we always talk about we don't need another big high profile $1 million Christian apologist. We need a $1,000,001 Christian apologists,
Amen.
people who are like, just, you know what? This is my daily discipline. You read, you pray, you serve in your church, whatever you may do. But I also create this content because I'm interested. This is the stuff that I think about all the time. I'm constantly like, I'll hear something and I'll say, oh, and I'll shoot myself an email and do the quick research. That's a future podcast. I want
Mm-hmm.
to talk about that because that interests me. And so that's kind of how we select that. And if everybody was creating some piece of content that's posted or even sent to their friends. I've got some friends, for example, who every day will shoot a text message to like 30 people. And it's just what they're thinking about in terms of scripture, something they read. And that is absolutely, if everyone was doing that, if we would be consumed with thoughts and concerns related to our Christian worldview rather than consumed with the news cycle. So I think that's one of the things we all could contribute if you're willing to contribute and not give a lick about whether or not you're growing a platform. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose is this is just an expression of my daily walk. It's a spiritual discipline. You get up every week, you produce something, you think out loud about your relationship with God so that other people can think out loud with you. And don't even give a second thought to whether or not it's growing your platform, building an audience, or producing any income. Got to let go of all that.
I've often said to Wyatt that what I want to really do on the show is help people grow in their faith and in their knowledge of God's word. And sometimes if we jump into a study on the book of Exodus, if you were a personal trainer, you would say, today we're working abs. And who wants to work abs,
Yeah, absolutely. I've been thinking a lot, and you let me hear your thoughts on this too, Bill. Like we often think about Christian service, right? Or Christian ministry. That word is to me, I don't even like that word because what does that even mean, right?
Right.
But Christian ministry, and we see it as something that like there are these paid ministers, which I think is great. I mean, people, but it strikes me that when I think of service as a new believer at the age of 35, like I realized, hey, I want to serve in some way. What I meant was I want to volunteer in some way.
Amen.
And we were doing that all until I started writing books. And then people would say, come on and speak about your book if you want, or come out and speak to our group. And at first I'm thinking, okay, great. Then they realize they're going to pay you to do that. They're going to pay you to go out and do what you would do for free.
Right.
And I realized at some point, hey, hold on now. Where's my volunteerism gone? Like, where is it that we are doing something and not expecting anything out of it except that we know that God has called us to do this? And even if you're somebody who's like a paid servant, a paid minister, you're serving in the church in some way, and ask yourself, where is it that I'm giving something without any expectation of anything in return? I think every one of us is called to do that, whether we are a paid minister or not.
Mm-hmm. Jim, let's jump into forensic faith. And let's talk about what is crucial for a forensic faith.
Well, the biggest thing is that whole word forensic comes from a Latin word, forensis, which simply means to be able to make a case publicly, to be able to make this case publicly. So a forensic faith is just a faith that you actually don't just embrace because it's a personal preference, but it is demonstrably true in a way that you could demonstrate it publicly. You could make a case for it in some other way, in some other setting publicly. And that's where I think that we are in a position as Christians to hold a uniquely forensic faith. Here's why. Unlike other theistic worldviews where a prophet comes up and makes a claim, or a spiritual leader comes up and makes a series of claims that have nothing to do with history. In other words, they're just like proverbs. It's like fortune cookies. They make these claims. They sound really great. You should live this way. Great. Those are important, by the way. But Christianity is not only it includes a figure, Jesus, who says a lot of important things about how we ought to live and about the nature of living, but does something in history that we can then examine and make a case for it. If your prophet basically just says a lot of sweet things, how would I ever defend? I can say, can't you see this is practically true? I guess you could do it that way. But if he does things that allegedly occurred in history, well, now I can at least go back and examine those historical claims. There's something I could investigate there beyond just whether or not this person is wise. Because the claim of the resurrection is the single most important claim in all of Christianity, according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. So that's a claim about something that happens in history. And that's why this kind of worldview that is grounded in historical data is at least testable in some way. And then we could argue, well, here's the evidence we have. You can make that kind of case publicly. And that's why I think that Christianity is the perfect kind of bedrock example as a place, at least, in which you could exercise a forensic faith if you wanted to.
Mm-hmm. And it will also protect us from false ideas, because there are a million false ideas floating around out there.
Absolutely there are. And as a matter of fact, that this is one of the things that taking an investigative approach did for me, is that because I wasn't sure what to believe. And when I first took a look at Christianity, my family is divided between atheists and people in the LDS church. And so, of course, most of my family was either not concerned at all about God or wanted me to join the LDS church, Latter-day Saints. And I was at the point was I wasn't sure what to believe. So I simply applied this kind of investigative approach to the claims of the Book of Mormon, and just to see if those claims were true. And I discovered right away that so yes, you're right. Taking this approach not only will direct you toward what is true, but it'll show you what's false. It'll protect you from what is false, as well as lead you to what is true. That's why this is an important approach to take.
Mm-hmm. And then it also has that way of getting you back home if you drift off the map.
Oh, there's no, yeah, let me tell you, this is perhaps, and I guess when I first started, I thought, well, I want to share with people how this atheist examined the evidence to become a believer. But I think you're absolutely right. It perhaps has its greatest strength in the sense that if you are a believer who has never examined the evidence for what Christianity teaches, well, a time is coming when you're going to be challenged. Life challenges all of us. And in that moment, it sure is nice to know that something is evidentially true, because it's if you're hoping, if the feeling that you had that got you into Christianity, it dries up because of the circumstances. Well, it sure is nice to know intellectually that this is true, whether I'm feeling it or not.
Mm-hmm. We're going to take a break and come back. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. You can go to Cold Case Christianity and check it out. We'll be right back. Hi, podcast listener. I'm Bill Arnold, and my theme song says, "What's for dinner?" And like when I'm grilling, I'm paying really close attention. And I know that ideal second to get the food off the grill. Like all good and ideal timings in life, right now would be an ideal time to be a cheerful giver to Faith Radio. Give now to support this podcast so that more people in more places might come to saving faith in Jesus and grow in their relationship and become a fully devoted follower. Click the link in the show notes or give now at myfaithradio.com. Welcome back to the show. J. Warner Wallace is my guest. I just got a nice comment from Ann. She said, if Bill is curious, he can type in common sense in the Bible. It has a lot to say. And that seems pretty true. There's a lot in Proverbs that we can learn about common sense. And other translations would call it prudence or discretion. That's all good stuff.
Yeah, no, just funny you were saying that, because during the break too, I was thinking, if you think about the difference right now between what we would say is common sense as our go-to thing, as humans go, yeah, we're just using my common sense. This is something we ought to go to. Mm-hmm. But it's wisdom. Where does wisdom reside? Where does it begin, according to Scripture, in the fear of the Lord? Right.
Right.
So again, we true wisdom. And this makes sense, right? Wisdom requires a lot of things, but like we talked about in the past, one of the things that wisdom requires is a moral foundation. And that's the problem with human wisdom. In other words, could I say to you, like this Nancy Guthrie case, what's the wisest way to do a kidnapping? That sounds like a strange question to ask
Hmm.
because you would say, well, there is no wise way to do, because there's a moral pillar in wisdom. Some things are just not wise to do morally to begin with. But anytime you add a moral pillar to something like wisdom, you've got to ground the moral notion somewhere. Because for people who commit kidnappings, maybe they get together for a conference, like what's the wisest way to do this? That group says it's okay, it's wise to do a kidnapping, and now they're searching for the wisest way. Do you see? You can't ground that moral notion in groupthink. You can't ground it in private individuals. It has to be grounded in something transcendent. And there's the problem. So that means that true wisdom cannot be grounded in human thinking, because we'll find somebody will say this something is wise that is morally repugnant. The question is, so if we're saying there's true wisdom out there, it has to be grounded in a transcendent source for morality, and that's why true wisdom cannot come from anything other than God.
Hmm. When you think of picking someone up out of the dirt, you're going to get messy yourself. That would maybe go against common sense. When people have abandoned someone because of a moral failure, as a believer, you should be one to race in to be there. And that goes against common sense.
Yeah, well, and a lot of that is just okay. You'll say to look at somebody and say that person is too immoral or too broken or too
Right.
fallen for me to, assumes that we aren't also immoral, broken, and fallen.
Right.
So it really it's about what's the standard you're comparing against. So what you're saying is, yeah, compared to me, that guy is a mess. Well, you shouldn't be comparing anyone to you. Compared to God, we are the mess.
We
I
are the
mean,
mess.
so if the standard is high enough, we are all a mess by comparison. And I think that people who understand that the standard is God have had a more gracious attitude toward other broken people, because they have the humility to know where they are, that they are also a mess. But for God's grace, they wouldn't also be included in any of this. And we have a tendency to think, well, my stuff's not as bad as your stuff. But that's because you're comparing me to you. But when you think that all of our stuff is repugnant to a holy, perfect God, if there is a God, he is powerful enough to blink everything into existence from nothing. That kind of power also means he's powerful enough to eliminate all moral imperfection in his own character. So that means we don't worship a good God. We worship a morally perfect God. And I think people who get that are more patient with other morally imperfect people.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I pray for, Jim, is when people come to the show and listen to the show, I pray that they'll grow in their knowledge and depth of understanding of who God is and God's word. And then I pray that they will become more resilient, because I think that is a great quality to have in today's world, is to have a resilience.
Well, yeah. And where does that resilience come from? That's the trick. Like you and I have also talked about this in all the years that we've been talking back and forth, this idea that people respond to trauma where they are in their lives because they cannot see the full story. And you have a tendency to stick in one chapter of your story and think, well, this is the end. Where I'm at right now, there's no next chapter for me. This is probably the same chapter from this point on, just repeated over and over and over again. And like we talked, maybe it was last time we talked, this idea that at the cross, everyone at the foot of the cross is terribly traumatized. And the person who seems the calmest is the one hanging on the cross. He seems calmer than everyone else in that scene.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the guy hanging on the cross, Jesus, knows the whole story. He knows this is just Friday, that there's a Sunday coming.
Mm-hmm.
And when you know the whole story, you can be calmer in any chapter of it. And so we have to really think about, what is God's story? Where are we in God's story? And know that there's a future for us. And that hope, it really has to come from us not feeling as though we're stuck in this chapter. There's still another chapter coming.
Mm. What are you working on right now? Anything I can talk about with you?
Well, and okay, so I'll just tell you that I'm in a season right now where, as you know, I am grandparenting.
Yes, I know
So
you
this
are.
is
You
the
got
season when I've got my little kids just walked in while I was podcasting. You probably heard Emma talk in the background here,
all
but
right.
this is just the nature of where we're at right now. I
Yeah.
think maybe next year I'll be able to return to write because for me, I need about 6 months of about 3 to 4 hours a day
Okay.
to do anything in terms of a book, right? Because a lot of research goes into books.
Yeah.
And this is just not a season. So this is a season of podcasting, a season of short videos, a season of things you can do in the nooks of in crannies of doing the most important thing, which is serving my wife
Hmm.
and serving my grandchildren. And so this is the season when I'll be doing that. And then probably this time next year, when the kids are a little bit older, we'll be able to do other things. But in the meantime, I think this is the time to really think and do those podcasts, do those things. Again, we're contributing $1 apologist. That's what we all are.
Beautiful.
Let's just do
Yep.
it. Be consistent as a $1 apologist, and we'll be fine.
You're a good man, Jim Wallace. Thank you so much for doing the show.
Yeah, glad to be with you this week.
All right,
Appreciate it.
thanks. Jay Warner Wallace has
All right.
been my guest. Go to Cold Case Christianity, and you can learn more about him and all of his work, his podcasts, his videos, his books. It's all there at coldcasechristianity.com. We're going to take a break, but when we come back, Dr. Don Byerly is going to join the program. We're going to talk about the return of Jesus, the Christ. I can't wait. Be right back. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.